Hello everyone, it's your boy Poohhead189, and today we're going to talk about the history and usage of Blackpowder weaponry in the Warhammer world, also called gunpowder of course, as well as dragon powder in far-off Cathay. Now, as you no doubt are aware, the Warhammer world, particularly the Old World, has a late Renaissance era field of technology, analogous to our world. Now, Warhammer goes back and forth on if the Empire is in the midst of a technological revolution, or if the world is sort of in a technological stasis. Some novels showcase new and incredible inventions, whilst the Imperial record of the Empire can make one think these inventions are one-shot wonders and individual successes that ultimately lead to nowhere. Gunpowder weaponry has been in the Empire for a few centuries now. There are some indications that the Empire had black powder centuries before that, like during the years 1712 and the invasion of Gorbad Ironclaw, which was roughly 8 centuries before the current year. However, those do not seem to line up with other sources. What we do know is that the Cathayans, like the Chinese of our world, invented it first amongst men, and the Chileans, the Warhammer equivalent to the Italians, were the first in the Old World to utilize them. However, the first race, at least allegedly, to use black powder weaponry are the Sky Titans, which are the race that eventually devolved into what we call giants. That is difficult to confirm, however. What we do know is that the dwarfs, give or take a few centuries around the birth of Sigmar, invented black powder weaponry on their own, and it's the most definitive dating for the first race to have invented or discovered it. One source says it's around 400 years before Sigmar was born, actually a few sources say that, which means the dwarfs invented it nearly 3,000 years before the current day. Though I will say that in the Nagash novels, it does allude to Cathayans having invented it even before the dwarves, around 1200 years before Sigmar, but the novels often don't follow actual canon of the source books, and that would also mean that the Cathayans would have rudimentary black powder weaponry for 4,000 years and not advance with it pretty much at all, which even the conservative dwarves did not do, so it's likely not true to the source material. Now, Arabians have had black powder for quite a while, though we do not know for how long exactly. They have something slightly different than the usual weaponry, however, in the form of jezzails. Now, both in Warhammer and the real world, those are essentially long-barreled, large-caliber muskets with greater range and stopping power than traditional ones, so large in fact they usually require a bipod or a stand to keep it steady. Both the Arabians and the Skaven use jezzails, though the Skaven also have experimental machine guns as well, and the Skaven firearms are not black powder, technically. They use warpstone instead as a power source. Highly volatile, as you might imagine. For those who don't know, warpstone is the raw, physical stuff of chaos and magic in general, so it's not really the best to use unless you are insane or a Skaven. Now, the black powder weaponry we know of the best is in the Empire and the Dwarves. I always find it a fascinating comparison when you look between the two allied factions. Now, the Dwarves have had it longer. Like I said earlier, it's very likely they have had black powder weaponry centuries or even millennia longer than any human faction. However, the Imperials, though knowing about black powder weaponry for some time, was really only gifted its secrets a few centuries ago by the Dwarves, although we do need to acknowledge there might have been some reverse engineering going on there as well. Now you see, the dwarves are incredibly smart engineers and almost unable to not be perfectionists. A dwarf is not the same species as a man, as you might know. Dwarves can see the smallest imperfections in stone and steel and are almost incapable of not making something to the best of their abilities. It's why they take years or decades to make an amazing sword, when a human would make a dozen in as many months, and they all might break within a few years. The dwarves tend to perfect, but they only innovate very rarely, and it takes many years for dwarf guilds to accept new inventions from young, aspiring beardling engineers. The Imperials, however, invent new things left and right, and as long as they can get a patent, it can then be used in the Imperial military. So this means that the Imperials have more options in weaponry, but the dwarf weaponry is far better, though there's less versatility. The dwarves, for instance, have 3 different types of artillery: the dwarf great cannon, the flame cannon, and the organ gun. In a fraction of the time, the Empire has almost a dozen types of artillery, along with steam tanks. Although I do need to note that these steam tanks were partially helped to be invented by the dwarves that worked at Nuln, so it's kind of a dwarvish invention too. However, the war machines the dwarves do have are more powerful, more accurate, and more reliable. It's the same with hand firearms. Both the dwarves and Empire have handguns. The Imperials have smoothbore arquebuses, though recently they have been able to utilize wheellock and flintlock rifles along with the lesser matchlocks. Well, not rifles, because they technically don't have rifling, so it'd be wheellock and flintlock muskets with the lesser matchlocks, as I said. The dwarves, however, have more reliable, longer-ranged rifles with actual rifling that increase accuracy. Both factions also have grenade launchers, though the Imperial launchers have a good chance of detonating in your hand, unfortunately. The dwarves have the Drat gun, and when they were first perfected, and then reorganized into other weaponry, they also now work perfectly. The grenade launcher units are typically referred to as Iron Drakes. However, that is not to say that the Empire is not very advanced. Due to its gunnery guilds, particularly in Nuln and Altdorf, the Empire makes quality firearms, even if it's not as advanced as the dwarves. Likely the most advanced in the Warhammer world amongst humans, though that is certainly arguable. The Empire has famous firearms like the Hochland long rifle and the experimental repeating handgun with the full name of von Mein Kampf's Whirling Cavalcade of Death. There is also an argument to be made that the reason the Empire had such high-quality armor, other than there being dwarves that live and work in the Empire, is that they are made to withstand pistol balls, and in some cases, musket balls. You see, contrary to popular belief, advancements in smithing techniques in our world made breastplates fairly effective against early gunpowder, and the reason armor eventually faded away was mostly economics and lack of availability to ever-growing armies. But armor and gunpowder fought side by side for multiple centuries in Europe and across the world, even up to the Napoleonic era. The Imperial Knights and state troops, though not impervious to blackpowder weaponry, have armor that can sufficiently keep them safe enough to charge handgun positions and not eschew the prominence of melee weapons, something the Bretonnians and the less armored southern realms have less exposure to. Though it does have to be said that the Bretonnians, though they are mostly clad in chainmail, do have protective magics to use whenever they have a border dispute with the Empire. And I do also want to note, something that people don't often know, is that while the Bretonnians do dislike blackpowder weaponry a lot, the law on blackpowder weaponry is really only on the land, which means that in various sources, the Bretonnian Navy actually has very sophisticated cannons. They just don't have the handheld guns or cannons on the ground. However, I also want to state that the prominent use of crossbows and handguns in the Empire has made them also increase the quality of their armor, particularly the breastplate, as I was saying. On another note, I should also say that Kislev has adopted a few firearms from trading with the Empire and highly values the Streltsy, which is a handgun and halberd unit, something real-world Russia utilized in the 16th century. And of course, the men of Nippon, which are literally analogous to the Japanese in the Warring States period, have the Ashigaru, who use arquebuses as well along with bows. Just like in our world, the bow and the crossbow throughout the Warhammer world have not been phased out due to the bow's rate of fire, and the crossbow's ease of use and stopping power, and of course various longbows are quite powerful as well. Both bows and crossbows are less expensive than guns, easier to maintain, and many civilians can use them to some extent from activities like hunting, whereas a gun is generally something available to troops or engineers, at least in the Empire. Now, what I'm going to do is give a brief explanation on the differences between the matchlock, the wheellock, and the flintlock for firearms, and then read a brief history from the Old World Armory, which is from the Warhammer Fantasy 2nd Edition roleplay. First, however, let's get into the specifics of the type of firearms. We begin with the matchlock. The matchlock was named after the manner in which the firearm was set off. A match ignited the powder to set off the charge. The first match was a twisted rope made of hemp which had been soaked in a solution of saltpeter and wine. It burned slowly and steadily. Before the match was invented, the shooter fired his gun by touching the powder with a red-hot wire or a glowing coal, which is the usual very primitive handguns. That meant he could never stray too far from a fire. However, a match could burn for hours, allowing the hunter more freedom to pursue game at greater distances if he is a hunter, or more usually a soldier to move about on the battlefield. The matchlock had a simple S-shaped piece of metal called a serpentine that was fastened to it, which held the smoldering match in one curve, away from the priming powder. When ready to fire, the shooter pressed the opposite end of the serpentine. This automatically moved the lighted match, bringing it into contact with the priming powder in the pan, thus setting off the charge. When the pressure was removed, the end of the serpentine holding the match moved back to its former position. In fact, the serpentine mechanism was the first trigger. With it, the shooter was now able to hold the gun with both hands and aim more accurately. As cool as the matchlock is, it has many disadvantages. Weather was the worst problem. Rain or high wind would put out the match pretty easily, rendering the gun useless. Next, we go to the wheel lock. You see, the wheel lock produced its own fire for igniting the priming powder. The device, obviously called a wheel lock, worked much like the modern cigarette lighter, actually. The wheel lock mechanism was wound against the tension of a strong spring. When the trigger was pulled, a serrated wheel revolved against a piece of flint. This caused sparks to ignite the powder and discharge the bullet. Although superior in many ways to the cumbersome and dangerous matchlock, and even superior to the flintlock in certain respects, the wheel lock too had some disadvantages. Its lock was a complicated mechanism and was therefore expensive, which is likely why it was more popular amongst dwarves, since something complicated was never a bother to them. Plus, it was relatively slow to ignite, because the wheel had to spin before it was discharged, and the wheel needed to be rewound after each shot before the gun could be reloaded, primed, and ready to fire again. We need to note that we do know the wheel lock was particularly popular amongst pistols, although it's difficult to say if it was the most popular. However, as I said, we do have confirmation some dwarves used wheel-lock pistols from various pieces of artwork, and it's highly likely the wheel-lock would be the favored gun for the Imperial Pistoliers, which are the light cavalry force of the Empire, usually made of noble sons or second sons, where they typically harassed the enemy, giving them the greatest glory with the least risk, and gave them some much-needed battlefield experience. Of course, there were some truly great soldiers, and you do need to be disciplined to be successful in that unit, and a wheel lock was typically a great firearm for it because you could actually keep it loaded. Now, let's go into the Old World Armory and see what it has to say about the history and various types of gunpowder weaponry, or blackpowder weaponry. Now, it says when cannons were first introduced, this made armor virtually useless, as cannon dealt impressive damage, capable of shredding soldiers with a single blast of grape shot or toppling walls with cannonballs. At first, these weapons were simple cannon, but soon smaller varieties were developed, allowing individual soldiers to use them. As Nuln engineers refined the process, they devised handheld firearms, repeating pistols, and more. And I should note that repeating pistols are used for the dwarves as well. In fact, in one of the End Times novels, one of the dwarf engineers had a revolver. Though there were several early and impressive advances, the technology is still experimental and costly to this day, and few warriors are willing to risk themselves and pay the expense of acquiring such weapons. Usually it has to be provided by the state. The old guns were quite primitive, being little more than metal tube with a wooden stock and a hole at the top where the wielder ignited the gunpowder with a punk or candle. All blackpowder weapons in the Old World are muzzle loaders, requiring the wielder to load powder and shot down the barrel. Most blackpowder weapons in the Empire are imports from the dwarves or are manufactured in Nuln and Altdorf. Now, for the matchlocks, shortly after the first development of the handgun and its profound failures against both chaos-heavy cavalry and mere rival knights in service to rival elector counts, engineers in Nuln developed a firing mechanism to allow the user to wield the weapon in two hands, thereby reducing the need for a stand. Essentially, a movable arm that holds a burning wick is locked back. Though the matchlocks are a drastic improvement over the early gunpowder designs, lighting the wicks take a lot of time, making the weapon virtually useless unless the wielder is prepared in advance. Furthermore, the Empire's climate makes keeping the wicks lit an arduous task, as I mentioned earlier with matchlocks, with gusting rains and damp climbs being murder on the firing mechanism. As a result, longbows are still preferred weapon for most regiments. However, with the wheelocks and flintlocks, in response to the continuing difficulties of firearm use, the Empire's engineers developed a new mechanism for firing, something that they probably also took from the dwarves. They replaced the spring-loaded arm with a spinning wheel. When the trigger was depressed, it caused the wheel to spin against a metal plate, causing sparks to fall into the flash pan. Developed simultaneously by Araby was the flintlock, so apparently the flintlock was invented by Araby, at least amongst humans, which is a variation on the wheellock design. In this improved mechanism, the trigger released a small piece of flint and to strike a steel plate to drop sparks into the pan. Now let's talk about specialized guns. First we have the Hochland long rifle. In the Duchy of Hochland, a place famous for its hunters, engineers devised a firearm that has an improved range over the blunderbuss and the handgun. While this weapon is superior to most other firearms in the Empire, it is rare and so prized that those who have them almost never sell them. For now, knowledge of their construction is limited to Hochland. Now, of course, there are also repeater handguns and pistols, though these are extremely rare in the Empire, and they still somehow utilize the wheellock and flintlock design. There is also the blunderbuss. A blunderbuss is a large firearm. You can load it with anything, really, nails, broken glass, small rocks, or just about anything else on hand, though shot is of course preferred. Because of the various types of ammunition, the blunderbuss has a very wide range of attack. A blunderbuss requires only a single shot of power per firing, but it fires 4 balls at once when loaded with standard shot. The blunderbuss is sometimes utilized in the Empire, but it's particularly utilized by the dwarves and the Chaos Dwarfs, and I hear there is also Cathayans with the blunderbuss as well, although that could just be the Total War games, I am unsure. Now, of course, while we've been talking about cannons and mostly handguns, we do need to talk about bombs. Now, a bomb is a hollow shell of ceramic or thin metal filled with gunpowder, stopped with wax and armed with a fuse. Bombs may be placed or thrown. A bomb's fuse can be cut to various lengths, and when a bomb detonates, it affects pretty much anything in a 10-yard radius. And of course, there are also incendiary bombs. An incendiary is a glass or ceramic container filled with a flammable liquid. A rag is often stuffed in the open end to prevent spilling and to act as the fuse, though of course this rarely really uses black powder unless it's sort of a small active ingredient in the concoction. Now, one last note on cannons. First developed by the dwarves, the cannon soon became the war machine of choice throughout the Empire. A cannon is a large muzzle-loading gun, meaning that the shot and the powder are loaded from the front and ignited by lighting the charge in the rear of the weapon. This is pretty much the case for the dwarves too, as well as the Cathayans and the Bretonnian warships, and pretty much anyone that actually uses gunpowder weapons for cannons, I mean. Essentially, cannons are larger, deadlier versions of gunpowder weapons. A precursor to the handguns and other weapons, the cannon presents a powerful force on which armies depend. However, though capable of shattering units, blasting walls, and killing huge monsters outright, they are unpredictable, capable of spectacular misfires that kill the crews and many around them, something that doesn't really happen with the dwarves, but does happen sometimes with the mannish design. Given the size of the crews required to operate them and the cost, which only cities can afford, cannons are rarely in the hands of just regular people. The first cannon were introduced about 5 centuries ago, imported by the dwarves and modified by the Imperial Gunnery School. These early weapons were either small and cast of bronze, or large and were banded wrought iron cannons. These were even more unreliable than modern cannons. These war machines sometimes fired arrow-like rounds, but were quickly replaced by stone and iron cannonballs. Recently, grape shot has seen greater use for anti-personnel, and hail shot, which is bundles of small rocks, nails, glass, or scraps of metal, is equally commonplace. As design and reliability improved, engineers fitted these large metal tubes to wooden carriages. Originally, the cannons were mounted on stone frames atop walls. By making them mobile, the use of cannon became even more popular with the Empire's legions. Now, nearly every army the Empire fields has artillery support, which has been instrumental in many battles in the nation's long history, especially in the recent tumultuous times. Alright everyone, that's about all I have to say today about Blackpowder weaponry. I might make a more detailed version of this video on the various units, but I felt like that's a good primer on Blackpowder weaponry. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Please like, comment, and share if you believe I deserve it, and subscribing would be great. I appreciate you all. Alright, see ya!